In our last episode, we talked about the role of interpretation in The Wife of Bath. And now we're going to talk about interpretation and a particular scholastic question we find in the Friar's Tale and in the Sumner's Tale. More of a playing with scholastic questions, a sort of Chaucer playing a game with interpretation again. So let's begin with the Friar. You notice how the Friar has a certain affectation. Do you remember this from the general prologue?
Somewhat he lipsid for his wantonness to make his English sweet upon his tongue.
That lisping is related to his quality of singing, but it could also relate to the quality of his preaching. You have to remember that the friars were not only licensed to give confessions, they could also be licensed, or they were also licensed to preach, which put them at odds with parish priests in that they would sometimes compete in the same urban locations. Now, the friars were famous practitioners of the ars predicandi, that is, the art of preaching. Now, rhetoric in the Middle Ages really has three branches. There is the ars poetriae, which is the art of poetry. We've been discussing a lot about that form of literary eloquence. The ars dictaminis, which is the art of prose composition, and document and letter writing, which was very important in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages basically invents the document. Of course, other periods had their documents, but our triplicate forms, our DMV bureaucracies, that is truly comes to bloom in the Middle Ages to our detriment. And then there's the ars predicandi. Now, we've talked a lot about rhetoric in this class, and I've told you that rhetoric is traditionally defined as the art of persuasion. That means the art of getting people to do things that you want them to do through words. When you start to focus on words, you start to focus on eloquence. Now, in the artis predicandi, the art of preaching, we suddenly see the Roman ideal of the orator returning. You have a preacher, like an orator, speaking before a civic public, but he's also using all his means to persuade an audience to embrace the Christian lifestyle. So in one way, we can look at this as a form of Christian rhetoric at the service of the church. Now, do we see elements of this Christian rhetoric in the work? The Wife of Bath. Notice how he compliments her.
Damn, quoth he, God give you a right good lief. Yan here touch it also must I thee in school mater great difficulty. Ye had said much thing right well, I say, but damn, here as we ride by the way, us needeth not to speaking but of game, and let authorities on God's name to preaching and to school of clergy.
It's kind of a backhanded compliment. She said right well. That is, she spoke well. Notice that word well qualifies the language, right? So that we're merely now thinking about eloquence. She preached well while expounding on matters of the university. And that's what he means when he says school matters. It's about, again, exegesis and interpretation, what the Wife of Bath does in her prologue. Now, friars were not only begging preachers, but they were also famous scholars. And like one of the most famous friars is St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, remember, the Wife of Bath's prologue is all about the problem of interpretation. But he says leave the auctorities to the professionals, whether to preaching or to the school of clergy. In other words, leave it to us friars. Now, the Sumner, in his own rebuke or quitting of the friar, plays with the idea of the friar's exclusive interpretive license over the Bible.
But we that humble been and chaste and poor, workers of God's word, not auditors. What he's saying is, friars are humble. They beg because they're mendicants. They're poor. They're workers of God's word. They're not listeners. So in other words, we're the talkers. You are the listeners.
Now, I'd like to know if his tale reflects this interest in school matters. Are there scholastic questions related both to Aristotle, logic, and theology? And there is. It's in the story of the Sumner and the bailiff, the devil. The Sumner is curious about how devils assume shapes. If you think bigger, he's asking, how does a lie take shape, since the devil's always associated with lies? Now, this is a scholastic question worthy of debate in a university setting.
Quoth the Sumner, Benedicte, what say ye? I wonder you were a yeoman truly. You had a man's shape as well as I. Han ye a figure then, determinate? In hell there ye been in your estate?
Do you have a figure determinate? What kind of quality determines the nature of the object? He's asking about the devil's form, his figure. Not like a man's form, because the devil's form is always a simulation, an imitation of natural forms. But in hell,
there have we none. But when us liketh, we can take us one, or else make you seem we been shape. Sometimes like a man, or like an ape, or like an angel can I ride or go. It is no wonder thing, though it be so. A lowly juggler can deceive thee, and pardie ye can I more craft than he.
Think of Morpheus taking on shapes in Machaut's Fountain of Love. That's also a simulation. What's funny is that the devil, as simulator, equates himself as a sort of jongleur, a conjurer, or a magician. But that's not the whole of it. A jongleur was first and foremost an entertainer, a minstrel, a singer, an itinerant storyteller, juggler. Now think of Machaut's characterization of Morpheus as a writer of texts. A writer, the devil is saying, can conjure images that are not true. But he's saying, I'm better.
Make ye new bodies thus always of elements? The fiend answered, Nay, sometimes we feign, and sometimes we arise with dead bodies in full sundry wise, and speak as renably and fair and well as to the Fintonisma did Samuel.
Many of you are fascinated by what is now called theory. But back in the 80s, Jean Baudrillard explored the nature of simulations.
The simulacrum is never that which conceals the truth. That's the devil, right? It is the truth which conceals that there is none.
A simulation is based on no reality because there is no reality in a simulation. So it hides no reality. Now, the devil's not a theoretician, right? He's far more practical than having to need any sort of philosophy.
Why, quoth the Sumner, ride ye then, or gone, in sundry shape, and not always in one? For we, quoth he, will us switch forms make, as must able is our praise for to take.
It's easier to catch souls in forms that are recognizable, right? This is almost like a rhetorical idea of persuadables, right? Things that make persuasion possible. And one of them would be recognition. Is it recognizable? There's also an interesting theological discourse on the use of devils in God's larger purposes.
But for thou askest why labor and we, for sometimes we've been God as instruments, and means to done his commandments, when that him list upon his creatures in diverse art and in diverse figures.
They have an instrumental purpose. And then the devil makes a university joke when he tells the summoner,
Thou shalt hereafterwards, my brother dear, come where thee needeth not of me to lair or learn, for thou shalt by thine own experience conne in chairs read of this song dance better than Virgil while he was alive, or Dante also. Now let us ride alive.
This is kind of funny. He's saying, from your experience with me, and in that case, the devil is on the side of the wife of Bath, you'll be able to lecture or read in a university-endowed chair on this sentence, and in this case, the subject matter or ways of cheating and deceiving others. And again, we also have poetry as lies or fables. You'll be better than Dante and Virgil, he's saying. And you get the joke, right? Because remember, Dante's Commedia, Dante takes a trip to hell with the Roman poet, and Virgil is his guide. So a poet gives another poet access to hell. Our access to hell is through poetry, but it's all false. It's not true, because I'm going to show you really how it's all about. The final scholastic element is related to intentio. And intentio can be understood as authorial intent. Prologues, remember, come from the scholastic tradition, and one of the questions besides the who, the what, the where of the prologue is also the why, the intentions of the author. So the summoner is caught in the end because of the role of intent. They run across a peasant who is trying to dislodge his cart from being stuck in mud. The summoner gets very excited. He says, here's somebody, he's damning the horse, the cart, and everything. He says to the devil, this is the guy, you can take him, right? He's damning everything. And what does the devil say?
Nay, quoth the devil, God wot, never a deal. It is not his intent, trust me well.
It's all about intent. And then the Friar's Tale ends on a joke made in the Miller's Tale, that the summoner will know more than any master of theology.
Thou shalt with me to hell yet tonight, where thou shalt known of our privité more than a master of divinité.
The Summoner's Tale also plays with some of these elements, naturally because this tale is about a corrupt friar. He not only uses some of the sermon forms that you find in the Artis Predicandi, for example. He includes a thema. He includes an exemplum. Both are features of the sermon. But his tale ends on a scholastic joke. Have you ever heard of that old question, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? It's a parody of scholasticism. It's a useless question that could only be thought out in a university setting, right? It's a condemnation of the friars. It's actually a famous example of a logical fallacy that's called a reductio ad absurdum or argumentum ad absurdum. How can a fart be shared by the friars' brethren?
The rumbling of a fart and every sound is but of air reverberation, and ever it wasteth little and little away. There is no man can deemeth by my fay, if that it were departed or shared or divided equally.
Clearly, Chaucer's having fun with this sort of intellectual inquiry. Every intellectual movement, every thought system produces its own forms of idiocy. You have to remember that.
Alright guys, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring that notification bell.